Laurie Colannino was the kind of woman who turned heads. Beautiful, vivacious, fun, outgoing. These were words that were frequently applied to the 23-year-old cocktail waitress from Clearwater, Florida. But Laurie was more than just a pretty face. This was a young woman with ambitions. Typical of her, those ambitions involved helping others. In December 1990, Laurie applied to paramedic school. It was her dream to qualify as an EMT. On the afternoon of January 2nd, 1990, Laurie Colannino returned from a workout at the gym. The Bay Point Apartments where she lived is a sprawling complex of 52 detached buildings, each of them comprising 8 units. Laurie entered hers at around 1 p.m, leaving her door open so that her cat could go out. She then picked up the phone and dialed her friend Scott Kelly. Scott had worked a late shift as a barman and was asleep when his phone rang. The pair started talking, but then Laurie suddenly let out a gasp and the phone went dead. Concerned, Scott immediately called back. All he got was Laurie's answering machine. It would take several tries before Laurie eventually picked up. "Everything's okay," she told him. "I've got to go." Then the phone was dead again. But everything was clearly not okay. Throwing on some clothes, Scott ran down to his car and started driving to Laurie's apartment. He arrived to find the door standing ajar. It was in the bedroom that he found his friend lying on the floor dressed only in a blood-stained t-shirt and a pair of gym socks. Scott immediately fell to his knees beside Laurie and started CPR. But it was soon clear that it was too late. Laurie was beyond help. Staggering to his feet, Scott went to the phone and dialed 911. To the detectives who arrived on the scene, the motive for this terrible crime was easy to determine. Semen on the dead woman's thighs was a giveaway. But whoever had done this also appeared to harbour a great deal of resentment towards the victim. Laurie had been stabbed multiple times. The autopsy would count 16 deep wounds, all of them centred on a small area around the heart. This overkill suggested a personal motive, and right now the police had a good suspect standing right in front of them. Laurie and Scott Kelly had been more than just friends and work colleagues. Turns out they'd had an on-again off-again sexual relationship, kind of a friends with benefits thing. Such relationships, although casual in principle, can often lead to festering jealousies. Is that what had happened here? Scott said no and insisted that he'd loved Laurie as a friend. He readily agreed to provide a blood sample for DNA analysis. Back then, the lab work could take months. For now, the police had no reason to detain Scott Kelly. He was free to go. But, as investigators were about to learn, Laurie Colannino had a rather convoluted love life. She was currently dating a chef named Eric Held and had an ex-boyfriend named Wayne Lafleur, who she'd recently reported for stalking her and for vandalising her car. Both men were brought in and questioned, and both offered alibis and agreed to provide blood samples. It would be a long wait before DNA could either clear them or flag one of them as a killer. Not that the police were placing all of their faith in DNA. Officers descended on the Bay Point Apartments and started questioning residents. This was a massive undertaking, but ultimately it would come up empty. Despite a vicious murder committed in a densely populated commune, no one had seen or heard anything. Months passed without a break. Then the DNA results were back, clearing all of the original suspects. With detectives thinly stretched and dealing with several other homicides, including an ongoing serial killer case, the Laurie Colannino inquiry was quietly shelved. It would remain stagnant until 1994. That was when the Pinellas County Cold Case Unit decided to take another look at the evidence. Technology had moved on in the intervening years. DNA tests were now faster and less expensive. It allowed the investigative team to undertake an ambitious project, testing every adult male who'd been living in the complex at the time of the murder. A surprisingly high number of these individuals still called the Bay Point home, and most of them agreed to provide a blood sample. All but one, in fact. The police were having a hard time tracking down Brian Calzacotto, a 31-year-old shoe salesman who lived in eyeshot of Laurie's former residence. Detectives made several visits to Calzacotto's apartment, but never found him at home. Notes were left, asking him to get in touch. Each time, Calzacotto failed to respond. That made him a person of interest, worthy of further examination. What investigators learned next only deepened their suspicions. It turned out that Calzacotto was a suspect in another murder, the 1986 shooting death of his father, a police officer in his hometown of Donora, Pennsylvania. A grand jury had been convened in that case, but it had been torpedoed by the extended Calzacotto family. Each and every one of them had taken the fifth on the stand, refusing to answer even the most mundane of questions. Even Calzacotto's widowed mother refused to speak up against the son who'd likely murdered her husband. As a result, the DA did not get the indictment he wanted. Brian Calzacotto had moved to Florida, where he'd taken up residence at the Bay Point Apartments. Now he was embroiled in another murder. The police were desperate to speak to Brian Calzacotto. It would be weeks before they caught a break in tracking him down. That was when Calzacotto's brother Alfred called in and reported him missing. According to Alfred, he'd been unable to reach Brian for several days. Using this as cover, detectives agreed to meet Alfred at his brother's apartment. They were stunned when they saw him. Alfred was a deed ringer for their suspect. The two of them were identical twins, and that presented investigators with a unique opportunity. Since identical twins have the same DNA profile, they could test Alfred against their crime scene evidence. If they got a match, they'd know that Brian was their man. The problem was that Alfred was wise to this. He had stood by his brother when he was accused of murdering their father, and he had his back again now. He refused point blank to provide a blood sample. Tracking down Brian Calzacotto was now the primary focus of the investigation, but Calzacotto appeared to have abandoned his apartment and he'd also absconded from his job. Investigators weren't even sure that he was still in Florida. 7 weeks passed before the police got another break. Calzacotto was arrested for theft after he was caught pickpocketing on Clearwater Beach. He'd soon find himself under interrogation for a far more serious crime. But Calzacotto was giving nothing away. Cool and collected under interrogation, he denied knowing Laurie Colannino and claimed that he'd been at work when she was killed. He also refused to provide a blood sample. Without probable cause to obtain a court order, the police had to let it drop. Despite their strong belief that Calzacotto was their man, they were forced to watch him walk away. He would remain at liberty for the next 5 years. By 2001, Laurie Colannino had been dead for 11 years. Her mother had died in the interim, never knowing who had stolen the life of her beloved daughter, never seeing justice done. The Pinellas County Police, meanwhile, were as determined as ever to take down the killer. They'd kept tabs on Calzacotto over the years, watched as he moved to Tampa, set up an apartment, and got a job at another shoe store. DNA technology had also made advancements during this time. It was no longer necessary to take a blood sample from a suspect. A profile could now be extracted from any biological material. Criminal cases are often resolved by the most mundane of actions. In the case of Brian Calzacotto, it was the act of taking out the trash. One night in 2001, Calzacotto walked out of his apartment and dumped a trash bag into an outside bin. He then walked back into his building, never knowing that he was being surveilled. The minute he was out of sight, officers emerged to retrieve the bag. It delivered a treasure trove of potential evidence, including a razor from which skin cells were extracted. Subjected to DNA analysis, it provided a perfect match to the semen found at the crime scene. That should have made this an open and shut case. But there was one major complication for prosecutors to overcome. Twins have identical DNA. How could they prove that it was Brian and not Alfred who had raped and killed Laurie Colannino? The defense, of course, was already thinking along these lines. In fact, it is quite likely that Alfred was on board with the strategy. Although he denied on the stand that he had killed Laurie, he did not appear particularly affronted by being accused of murder. It was left to the jury to draw its own conclusions. In the end, it came down to proximity. Alfred had been working in Tampa at that time, in a secure building that required him to sign in and out. He'd just started the job, which meant that he would not have had time off. Given the 30-minute drive he'd have to make either way, it would have been impossible for him to commit the murder. Brian, on the other hand, worked just a short walk from his residence at the Bay Point Apartments. He'd have had no problem committing the murder and then returning to work. His semen at the crime scene proved that he had done exactly that. The prosecution argued that Calzacotto had been standing in his apartment when he spotted Laurie Colannino returning from the gym. He'd probably seen her before, perhaps at the complex swimming pool where she enjoyed lounging. Laurie was a woman who easily attracted male attention. Calzacotto had probably been lusting after her for some time. On this day, he decided to act on his desires. Hey friends, thank you for listening to today's story. Make sure to click the notification icon to stay updated on all future narrations. I release new videos twice every day at 10 AM and 8 PM Eastern Time. If you have a story to share, please send it to the email displayed on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave an encouraging comment. It really helps me keep bringing you more narrations like this. If you'd like to support the channel even more, you can get early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.